Welcome to Expanding Your Faith, a podcast that tackles modern-day issues with a focus on spirituality, with Bishop Greer Godsey, Reverend Marc Trimm, and Bishop Ben Williams. Thanks for listening. Take a breath, open your heart, and let's expand your faith together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Expanding Your Faith. I'm Bishop Greer, and joining me tonight is Reverend Marc.
Greetings, everyone.
And our producer, Bishop Ben.
Blessings to all.
And our very special guest tonight, returned from a couple of weeks ago, Padre Ricardo Romero. Hello, Padre Ricardo.
Hola. Bishop Greer, thank you for having me on this week. If I should suddenly disappear like I did last week, when I just suddenly disappeared, it means that we have had a power failure in our area because of the heat, or that I've been raptured.
Well, hopefully it's not the latter, because that means we got left behind.
I wrote some books about that, right?
Right.
Quite a bit of money's been made on the subject, I am told.
Oh,
That is right.
yeah.
Just a reminder before we get started, you can always catch our previous episodes of the podcast at podcasts.myocci.social or on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite podcast from. And as always, we record these episodes on Saturday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on younow.com/Bishop Greg and on TikTok at symbol expanding your faith. So tonight we're going to do a continuation of the previous time Padre Ricardo was with us, the Veritas Manifesto and the Nazareth Manifest, which he's going to talk to us some about the 5 pillars of the entire project. This project, of course, is to help those most in need in our communities and around the world who are marginalized and abused and without support and without help under the current political climate. Mostly those that are immigrants, but also anyone who is facing marginalization and need. So, Padre Ricardo, you want to go ahead and talk about some of those 5 pillars?
Absolutely. Thank you again, Bishop Greer, for inviting me to be on this podcast, Expanding Your Faith. And it's a pleasure to meet Dr. Marc and to be back again with Bishop Ben. Last time I was on the podcast, I spoke mostly about the Nazareth project that the Office for Faith, Justice, and Humanitarian Efforts is going to commence exactly a week from today on August 1. It'll be a 42-day campaign, and it'll culminate on September 11 with a live webinar about the Veritas Manifesto, which is a document that the church, the OCCI church, has adopted into this project, and the first project of the Office of Faith, Justice, and Humanitarian Efforts. I'd like to first mention that when Bishop Greer asked me if I would consider being the director of this office, I felt inspired by the Holy Spirit that this was going to be probably the most challenging project that I've done in the 30 plus years that I've been involved in church work. And the more I get into it, there's 2 things that come to mind. The more I realize that how much I don't understand and don't know. And the second part is how big the burden is to be able to put this project across and get it started, to get it sparking. Now, Bishop Greer and I met back, I think, around 2006. At that time, I was a seminarian, and I was also an activist in Maricopa County in Phoenix, Arizona. And Sheriff Joe Arpaio was starting what he became very nationally famous for his immigration raids on the undocumented. And he began rounding up these undocumented workers. He created a prison in the back, way out there in the sticks of Maricopa County, with no air conditioning or any kind of provision for the high heat. He created what he called Tent City, where he put all of these immigrants until they were able to be sent to the detention centers. And so Bishop Greer heard about my activist work I was doing with the Sheriff Joe's and all that. And so he asked me to be a guest on his radio show. And I think I made at least 2 or 3 guest appearances on the show. It's funny to say radio guest appearance, but that's when we first became acquainted. And I realized that Bishop Greer and I had a mutual passion, especially when it came to representing those that are afflicted, those that are persecuted, the downtrodden of our society. We're we're very much on the mutual ground on that. And so when he asked me to become the director of this office, it was following suit with our long history that goes back these many years together. And I shared with him a document that a colleague and I had drafted entitled the Veritas Manifesto, tutela immigratorium, Latin guys, immigratorium, immigrant. Now, I don't know how many people that are watching or listening to this podcast have any background in Latin, especially ecclesiastical Latin. And so I'll just stop in a second and explain for our audience what this Latin words mean. Veritas is the Latin word for truthfulness. The Romans put a very high, they considered truthfulness as a very high virtue to have. It was important for any honorable Roman to be absolutely truthful. And so where this applies to this issue relating to immigration is that through media, mostly generated right-wing media, such as like Fox News and so forth, they always refer to the term illegal immigrant. You hear this term, it's been used since going back to George Bush days in the 2000s, the illegal immigrant. And that is an untruthful term because there isn't any human being in this planet that is illegal. That just simply doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so that is the first lie that comes out of the media, that we have this problem with illegal immigration or illegal immigrants. And then it's always, when you put the term illegal behind it, it gives a connotation of something involving criminal law, breaking some type of criminal law, like in murder, assault, robbery, all these type of things. Those are governed by criminal law. And people think that being an undocumented migrant into this country makes you illegal, and therefore you've committed a criminal act, and it should be apprehended, handcuffed and detained, and eventually deported, because we are a nation of law and they have to obey our laws. I think the first thing to make of clarity regarding this idea about immigration having a legal factor to it is that that's not true. The whole Department of Immigration is administered by the Department of Justice and not the federal court, state, or city court system. Therefore, all the judges and the prosecutors and all that that are dealing with immigration, all of them are governed by the Attorney General. That is the chief officer of the Department of Immigration, and the legislation for immigration is done by the Congress, not by the states, not by the cities, not by the Congress, the ones that make the legislation relating to immigration. And so the concept that being here undocumented makes you illegal and therefore doing a criminal act is another lie. Actually, the citation for being in this country without documentation is about the same level about getting a traffic ticket. It's about that part, which is in a civil court. All of the immigration litigation is done in the justice court, not as a part of the federal justice system or the state justice system, but under the justice system administered by the Department of Justice. So many people say, I'm all for immigration, I'm just against illegal immigration. And I asked those people just exactly how would you define legal immigration? And most of them, if not all of them, just about don't know the answer to that question. They don't know the first step about what a person has to do to become an immigrant to this country. But the other thing is, many, if I'd say over half, I'm not sure exactly what would be the percentage, but it would be well over half of those that are presenting themselves to the border without documentation are here seeking refuge. They're refugees. They're seeking some type of asylum. And so under that, going back to President Jimmy Carter and the international community drafted international laws relating to those seeking asylum, refugee status, and how does that work? What is the system to process somebody who presents themselves to an immigration officer and says, I am seeking asylum? Just what is the system that does all of that, that determines whether they can be granted asylum or not? And so when these people come to the border, and by the way, I live in Blossom Valley, California, which is in northern San Diego County, and I'm about roughly 20 miles from the Mexican border. And so I'm frequently, before the pandemic, I used to go down to the border to buy prescription drugs and all that type of stuff over there. And you hear these stories about I'm against open borders and President Biden had open borders, all that. Believe me, there's no open border there. You'll get the border there, and you'll see a mile long of cars backing up as they get questioned at the border by the immigration, the federal authorities that question people when they're crossing the border. There's just not an open gate and people just driving through. It's just not there. In fact, you could probably get stuck in Tijuana and traffic there waiting across the border for 3 or 4 hours. That's how long that line is. So that's hardly an open border. Another open lie about that. But nevertheless, this being so close to the border, I see a lot of the people that do come here that do ask for refuge, to be refugees because of some type of political danger that they face, like in Central America. Also, some of them are driven over here because they lost their farms because of corporate farming taking over the industry, and all of these local farmers get put out of business, and then they have to work for slave labor. And many of them, and I've known many of them in my activism work in Phoenix, they cross the border because the town they're living in is unsafe for their children to grow up because of the drug cartels that are running that town, and the amount of death rate that's from the cartels there. So they come to this country saying, we seek safety because it's danger of us being killed in our community. At that point, they are, according to the rules that we used to go under before President Trump, they would be given a status of seeking refugee status, asylum, and they would be put through the system where they'd be meeting before the court to explain exactly why they believe they should be granted asylum. All of that is very legal. None of that requires that you have to have documentation in advance to come into the country. It just says you show up and you say you're seeking asylum, and that automatically puts you into the system. That's the way it worked until we came up to President Trump's first term, and his first Attorney General, Jeffrey Sessions, announced all of those rules were suspended. We are no longer going to accept anyone seeking asylum into this country. The gate is closed. And he even said, you are not wanted here. Go back. And if you come here, we will hunt you down. And then I heard these same messages echoed through with the press secretary, what's her name, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, said the same thing. And she even put, in Romans, she says, it says that you're supposed to follow civil law and obey the law and bless the leadership. And so now the law and leadership is saying, don't come here, go back. You're not welcome here. All of this was done without any approval of Congress or the political system at all, the legislature and all this type of thing. It just shut down because Trump wanted to shut down, and he wanted absolutely no immigration, zero immigration. As you know, one of the very first things he did when he was president was to create the travel bans from all the countries, Muslim countries, not being allowed to be coming to this country. So therefore, there are all these lies that exist regarding to immigration. And so the first word, the Veritas Manifesto, Veritas meaning truth, truthfulness, a revelation or a revealing of truth. And that's what I like to look at this thing as the Veritas Manifesto, the document that has the 4 provisions that we're going to talk about, the 4 pillars of it. That is sort of like a picture as a name of a boat, the name of a ship, the good ship, Veritas Manifesto. Now, in the engine room of that boat is the Nazareth Manifest. The Nazareth Manifest is, of course, the manifestation of the scripture from St. Luke, where Jesus commanded the disciples to liberate those that were being oppressed, to release the prisoners of oppression and so forth, the downtrodden. And so the engine room is the Nazareth Project. That's what's going to actually drive the energy to making contact, to get people more in line with the truth. So I would say, to sum this all up, the thesis, if you want to look at, of what the Veritas Manifesto is, that it argues that the social justice movement in the United States can successfully counter current threats and promote progressive democracy by implementing innovative strategies that prioritizes collective action, intersectional collaboration, and an adaptive resistance to this. Um, Now is a very dangerous time in our nation's history in relation to its treatment of immigrants. The prosecution of the undocumented is tied to a political agenda aimed at maintaining white dominance and economic profit at the expense of labor rights. Now, you may ask, how does labor rights figure into this? Well, actually, uh, immigrants play a big part of our economy, especially in the areas of labor in certain industries such as agriculture and hospitality. Immigrants fill in where there's a need for labor to do that. And so by restricting the amount of immigrants that can come in to do those jobs, it's actually hurting the economy as far as agriculture and hospitality. Also, don't realize just how much the immigrants give to the economy of this country. One thing, I believe they pay the highest rate of income tax. Them or many of them purchase security cards so they can find employment. And of course, when you get employed by a company, if it's a car wash or working on a farm or doing janitorial services or anything like that, you have to have a social security number and taxes are taken out. However, the migrants rarely, if ever, in for a refund of taxes because in a situation working with an illegal social security number, they want to keep a very low profile. You may remember when this thing started with President Trump, he said that they were rapists and assaulted criminals and that they're emptying their prisons of the worst and sending them over here and all that. Actually, the statistics bear that to be absolutely false. In fact, crime in the immigrant community is very, very low, which is logical. You're in this country without documentation and being very careful not to be detected. You're hardly going to put that all at risk by shoplifting or assaulting or robbery or even murder. You wouldn't do any of those things because you'd realize the end result would not only be imprisonment, but also deportation. And so the immigrant community is always pretty low in the crime rate. But let me ask, how do they exactly contribute to the economy? Well, everybody that goes to the gas station and buys gas pays tax, gasoline. You go to the supermarket and you pay tax on coffee and everything else that you buy. Virtually everything that you do, whether it's sales, whether it's buying or services and all this type of thing, it puts back into the economy taxes and all that, which in the case of the immigrant community is not ever claimed back. The economy, President Trump's immigration laws is drastically hurting the economy because of the keeping the immigrants away from this. Now, where did this all bring me to when we drafted this document and this idea? And that's because I believe churches are deeply rooted in the immigrant community. Churches often serve as lifelines for Latino immigrants coming from Phoenix. I can attest to that firsthand as I was a part of that. We offer spiritual comfort, often physical support, and a sense of community and belonging. Of course, it's very scriptural about accepting those that are strangers in your land and treat them to remember when you once, the Lord, it says in scripture, you once yourselves were strangers and everything. However, under the Trump administration, very difficult for churches, activists to volunteer to do work with the immigrants because, especially now, ICE and it's hard to say the way it operates without any kind of oversight and anything like that. They're completely on their own, make their law in their own hands, and all that. The parishes are, how would you say, deadlocked. And maybe how can we do this without putting ourselves at significant risk? And how can we find those that need to have that support that we could bring to them? What this all comes down to is, why did we put this together? We believe, my colleague when we wrote this, we believe that the congregations offer tremendous potential to this problem dealing with immigration, and especially now with ICE and the way they're running. A congregation presents a very dynamic network of individuals who are very much connected, a web of relationships to various groups, workplaces. Within a church, you can create a network that can be leveraged for impact. it just comes down to exactly how can you leverage that, and exactly what are the components that would make a difference in, with the support of immigrants and protection of immigrants. So I'm just going to take a pause here and just ask. I've given you a lot of information here so far about the backup, about Veritas Manifesto is. Before I get into the actual 5 pillars of it, I thought I'd just pause a minute and see if anybody has any comments that they'd like to make or questions that they might ask about it at this point.
I have two. Had done some research, and the contributions for the range anywhere from 60 to 100 billion a year in tax revenue. Some reports say upwards of 100 billion, some conservatives back to about 60 billion. And that all goes in across the local and national economies. And so, it's not a insignificant number. And those are migrants that aren't necessarily documented, that are coming and contributing. And I think that is important, especially now when we have shortfalls in Social Security and we have shortfalls in a lot of local governments, plus a lack of individuals working in certain areas is causing prices to accelerate. It's funny to me, well, not funny in a humorous way, but in a sad way, that
Peculiar.
Yeah, that these raids, particularly in farms and say places, and then all of a sudden the word got back to them, say, well, you can't take away the workers from the farms because then that's really going to cause prices to escalate, or food shortages, and then all of a sudden they backed off, and then they started back, and then they backed off. I don't know what they're doing right now, but I would like to ask a question. This may be too loaded of a question. A lot of that, I mean, there are people in our nation that aren't legitimately safe characters. They're not good people. There are going to be some of those that will sneak through.
The criminal element.
Yeah, there's always going to be a small group, very small. I don't believe, I'll say this outset, I don't believe that the immigrants that are coming here are all terrible, but you're going very, very small. What does reform look like to you, someone who's studied it for so long? What does reform look like to you to help us to catch those characters, but at the same time, taking on and what Christ taught us to do, and that is to welcome people, to have them here so that they can work hard. And, I think nobody's under the delusion, except for a very small group of our population, that those that come here are hard workers, and they really are just trying to make life better for themselves and their family. But what does that look like to you? Because that's a question on a lot of people's minds.
Right. Before, I'm going to answer that in two ways. If you had asked me that question before 2016, if you had that question during the Obama administration, even in that question during the Bush administration, I would have said that reform should look at not only its vetting of individuals that are coming into this country, the system of vetting the people through interviews and so forth needs to be improved and brought up to date. It's terribly archaic, way behind. Not enough workers to take all that input, and so there's no possible way they could effectively vet who the criminal element is from the legitimate family that's trying to seek refuge in the country or employment. So prior to, I would have said reform is going to take a good look at not only improving the system and streamlining the system so that the vetting process can be more complete and not so, ignored for all that. That would have been sort of the general direction I would have thrown you towards. However, since the Trump administration and the amount of grift and the amount of corruption that has hit the judicial system, which, like, for instance, right now they're considering a candidate to be attorney general who formerly was President Trump's criminal lawyer, and it's hard to consider that to be a good, aspect to making him attorney general. And right. So when you have a system in the judicial system that's straight out corrupt or being operated by corrupt individuals, then virtually the idea of creating reform to streamline this, make it up to date and effective, and vetting system, all that, that gets thrown in the back seat. What's on the seat is all of the hoopla they can make in their deportation, the detentions, and all this type of stuff, and everything, and all the grift and corruption that goes into that. When you have a president that says, I will give anybody citizenship in this country if you give me $5 million. And so right away, he had scores of people that came in that could afford $5 million, and they got, that's corruption. And so what I would look to now is that we have to look at a reformation of our criminal justice system and our judicial system at large, because of the way it has been manipulated by this administration corruptly. So that's like a 2-point overview. If you get a crystal ball and say, what would it take to fix the system right now, I would say you'd have to start straight at the source, at the judicial system, at a reformation of the judicial system before you can actually get something moving on a legislative level to streamline the system and create a better system of vetting, etc. And don't forget, many of the immigrants that do come across have valuable skills, like instructional. For instance, I was at a family in Phoenix where this guy was a craftsman as far as laying down tile, wooden tile, and everything. And he made very good living at it, doing that. But he was undocumented, of course. But nevertheless, he was a skilled person that knew what he was doing. The other thing I want to mention, too, when you talked about the amount of income that comes in through taxes, through migrants, and so forth, another lie or fallacy, I've heard this many, many times from even good friends of mine. They'd say, I work hard in life. Nobody's ever given me anything. I've had to make and all that. I just resent the fact that somebody that suddenly can get welfare, an immigrant, an undocumented person, an illegal, can now find themselves getting health care, and I can't. I have to pay my prescription. They get free health care. Some of them are even put up in hotels and everything like that. They're getting their rent paid by the government and all that. Well, I can tell you that's just categorically not true. Migrants get the immigrant who are here without documentation that would be considered by our terminology as illegal, get absolutely nothing from both state, city, federal government, absolutely nothing. Now, I had a good friend of mine. I went to school with her all the way through high school and all that stuff. She became a nurse, and she was working in the OB/GYN floor of the hospital, delivering babies and all that stuff. And one time when at lunch, she said, Rick, I'm just so sick and tired of these illegals, because they come here and they get treated like royalty. They get all this free medical care, and they get and we have to wait on them like we're their servants. And I resent that. And I told her that's categorically not true. A hospital does not have people coming into it for free, especially if they're an undocumented migrant. There's no government money pouring into there. Nobody's getting there's no such thing as a free lunch there and that. So I just want to make that point. But to answer your other question about that, those are the 2 points that I would see as far as looking at it in the reform line.
This issue, obviously, since the 80s, where people have decided they didn't want to do something. And as I became of age to vote, I remember in the early 2000s, the Bush administration reform immigration, and the amount of political pushback was insane. And so it started kicking down the road and down the road.
Now you mentioned something, if I can just stop you for a second, just to point out, this is something that frequently gets looked over. Prior to George Bush administration in 2000 to 2008, the whole Department of Immigration was its own separate federal Department of Immigration Services, But after September of 2001, within 14 days, the Bush administration put through what they call the end game, which was a project to deport at least 13 million undocumented immigrants into this country, and all the companies that own private prisons suddenly became extraordinarily wealthy, because that's where they were putting all these people that they're picking up and everything. But what he did under the Bush administration was he took this new Homeland Security, part of the cabinet around immigration, to be administrated and operated by Homeland Security.
Yeah.
So now we no longer have a separate Department of Immigration Services like we used to have prior to President Bush. Now we have Homeland Security operating and running ICE, for instance, and all these other law enforcement agencies that are involved in that. So we took away this department and we wrapped Homeland Security around it. And of course, the Secretary of Homeland Security, a part of the cabinet, is picked by the president, which is always in the president's political agenda. And we know how that's working with this agenda right now. So I just want to bring that up. So I didn't mean to interrupt you on that, but I just want to clarify how the wrapping around of immigration with Homeland Security, which I never could figure out why immigrants posed a threat to Homeland Security in the first place, because all of those 12 saboteurs on 2011, 11 of them were from Saudi Arabia, I believe.
Yeah.
And they were all visas. None of them were here undocumented. Go ahead, brother. Go ahead with your next question.
No, I think that you're in that instance, not to make an excuse, just an observation. I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to the times, and then I try to believe that where people may have had decent intentions, but it all unraveled, and now that it's become a hot button topic, always want somebody, and that's what we've got. We always want somebody to blame for whatever. We just make things up. And the truth of the matter is our immigrants are not the place to go, in my opinion, to blame for where we are. They're contributing. They're doing what our ancestors, unless you're native to our ancestors, have been trying to do since they got here. And that's just to live life better. To try to do better, to work, and I sit around with members who hawk all this talking about earlier. They don't contribute, they're just our resources and all that stuff, and you're like, and some of them, my family members, have hired people they know don't have documentation, only because they come and do a fantastic job at house repair. And I'm like, talk about hypocritical.
That's another interesting point you made.
Drives me up the wall.
Rewind, go back to the years being the oldest man in the jurisdiction. I can say this. When Ronald Reagan was elected to be governor of the state of California, Ronald Reagan, governor of California, Republican, who formerly had been a Democrat and all that, president of the union and all this type of thing. Now he's Republican. Ronald Reagan wanted to break the back of the United Farm Workers Union. And so the best thing he did was just basically put a big welcome sign at the border at Tijuana that says, come on over, and we can push jobs. And so you have this whole flood of people coming over here to get these jobs that were being taken away from the farm workers and now giving it to the people that were willing to work for less money and not be union members. And all that type of thing. And you know what happened with these people? They had kids.
Right.
And so now you have a whole group of kids that are not citizens. Their parents are not citizens of this country, and here they are. They're being deported back to the other country where they never grew up in that country, have any idea what it was about, So it's played there. And I've seen it. In fact, I was once organizing a rally in Phoenix, a march. And it attracted like around 40,000 people this march. We needed to have a really big stage. We had these speakers that were going to be giving their speeches and everything like that type of thing. And so we had no money to organize this thing. So we're taking money from any place we can get it and everything. But we needed to construct the stage and put up all the sound equipment and do all that busy, heavy work. And so here it is, this committee that I'm working with, activists for the Latino community that are protesting the way that the immigration sweeps and all that type of stuff. And you know what they told me? They said, we don't have the money to pay somebody to come and do this. So go out and find a couple of illegals and have them do the work cheaper. That was their own, this committee telling me them because they're cheap. Actually what they told me to do is go to Home Depot, and park out at Home Depot. And then you pick up workers there and you'll be able to pay them just a couple bucks an hour. And they'll be glad to get it. And yet we're organizing this march to protest the way they're being treated. I mean, it's sort of like there's always pushing, make them again. So where does he get all his stuff, the hats, everything? From China, right? So that makes a lot of sense. It just doesn't, how do you say, it doesn't match up. It's contradictory and all that type of thing. But anyway, is there anyone else that has any questions before we move on to the main points of the Veritas Manifesto?
So let's go ahead and go to the 5 points, Padre Ricardo, and let's let you go ahead and lay those out in the time we have remaining.
Very good. Very good. The object of the campaign is really threefold. First of all, is to protect its citizens, to provide a shield for the immigrants, offering protection and solidarity as the survival and resilience with the church community and the immigrant, preparing for the worst times ahead. How they say, a good offense, so be prepared. And then the other is to expand the movement itself, especially in our own church group, the Independent Sacramento movement, to engage them in the support and protection of the migrant communities within their parishes and all that. So we're looking at recruiting on a grassroots level, and really what we're searching for people who just maybe have an interest in the subject. Rather, we're looking for people that are more than interested, but are passionately willing to engage themselves personally in it, whatever that may take, whatever level they want to come in on it. We want to get what we call this here leadership, into the movement. So, number one, in these 5 things, looking at, one is that we have to unite our leadership. The leadership not only in all that, but the leadership within our own parish communities, to bring us together, fostering a sense of unity and cooperation among us all. And then secondly, we're looking for shared understanding, and this is something that, in the understanding, we have to put some analysis and strategy as far as understanding exactly what is the problem that we're looking at, and how can we create a strategy with a successful tactic that sees us coming through on the other side. So the second part is this, the second pillar is to understand through analysis and strategy and tactics how we can go about improving the situation and offering more protection. The third thing is what we connecting levels, or to bringing back all of the grass movements, bringing all the different, fingers of activism. For instance, when we had the Black Lives Matter thing happen, what was around 2020, when we had the George Floyd killing, that we had all these protests. And suddenly you saw this groups and groups of people like Black Lives Matter and other groups peacefully marching and protesting the violence against the Black community and all that. This idea of connecting all of these groups. Now, one thing that recently has played out very effectively has been was it in Minnesota, where we had the killing of that nurse, the male nurse, and the young woman, the mother in her car that was shot.
That was up in Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, right? They set a very effective network that really wasn't connected to a central base, in a sense like they had a central, rather you have all these different, somehow they connected with each other through their own interplay with a personal level with people, and they created a very strong network of being able to protect the other activists from being killed or roughed up or captured or whatever. There's a term that just slips my mind, Brother Greer, what that's called, that strategy, where it's all isolated groups but yet working on a unified group together.
Yeah, decentralized activism.
Something like that, right?
Yeah,
it's a new wave of activism now, and I think it has great potential. The fourth pillar is the citizen engagement pillar. This is the part where our webinar series that we're going to start with the Nazareth Manifest. This part is where we offer training programs. We offer informational sessions, chat sessions, for instance, online or wherever, giving information of what are your rights. For instance, you have, this has happened to me many, many times when I was in Phoenix, you have an undocumented migrant calling you on the phone or pounding on your door in the middle of the night saying, I'm scared. I'm afraid they're chasing me, or they're going to get my father, my mother, or whatever. What do I do? Where do I go? What's going to happen to me? And so what we did, and I began to having workshops, how to construct a power of attorney, so that if a minor children and they get detained and maybe even deported, those children will not get placed into some type of social services, and possibly even face deportation themselves. If there's a power of attorney, they can go to a relative, or a trusted friend and legally. So we held workshops on how to make power of attorneys, and then also if they're knocking, you have a customs enforcement agent knocking your door. Do you have to open your door? Do you have to let them in home? If you're driving and all this, pull you over, do you have any rights when you get pulled over? These are all relevant questions, and they can be addressed into chat sessions, into workshops, and other, how do you say, work together with the migrant community to bring a sense of not only education, but awareness of what they're dealing with. And so that part, number 4, of the citizens engaging into it. And then we come now to the 5th, and this is what we've labeled a messaging. This is developing an effective messaging system and mobilization system, especially involving children, migrants that have children, being able to create a sense of messaging and communication, and also creating a sense of, I would say, intergenerational unity, where you have older generations maybe helping younger generations, and all working towards survival preparation for the migrant community. This involves citizens and migrants working together under that 5th pillar of effective messaging and networking. So these 5 areas are the areas that we cover in the Veritas Manifesto. Initially, when we wrote it, it was 40 pages long, and we've reduced it down to 20. And so this is a document at our blog at the Office of Faith, Justice, and Humanitarian. If you want to download it and read it in full, you can get all of the details that are in between all this stuff. And if you have any questions, you can write to me or Bishop Greer, and we can address those questions for you. So in closing, let me just say about this. This is, as I mentioned earlier, probably one of the most challenging projects, if not the most challenging project I've ever taken before. To be able to effectively support the immigrant community, it requires those 5 essential components, working in cooperation with the local jurisdictional level of your church community and your parishes. We also need to look at how to say, making our parishes more conscious and aware of what's happening, not only with the administration, but the way the administration is carrying out its policies towards immigrants and the way they're detaining immigrants. More than ever, we need to come on board on this. And I think that the severity almost daily gets worse. Each day I read more about unlawful detentions, even murder, families being irretrievably broken. This is happening now. I've seen many parishes turn away from it because they view it as too political, and they think that that is a separation of church and state, and that this is a political matter. Actually, it's not. This is a matter that actually involves what I call institutionalized sin. In other words, take the sin of slavery. Slavery is a sin, but yet our institutions for many slavery, and now I think there's an interest to return to slavery, even, especially if they enact some type of guest worker program or something like that. So we need to look at this as a spiritual community. This is not a political problem. This is actually a problem that deals with a deeper sense of morality. Anyway, thank you, Bishop Greer, for giving me this time to present this subject. It is a very complex subject, and it's very compelling, and it is playing out in real time right now in a very dynamic way. I can tell you personal experience. When I lived in Phoenix, and I was born and raised in Phoenix. My father was born in Phoenix. My grandmother lived in Phoenix when it was Arizona Territory. I must have been detained and pulled up by the sheriff's department when I lived in Phoenix probably over 50 times. Literally detained, made to stand spread eagle in front of my car and search for nothing more than just trying to find out whether I had legal documentation to be in this country. And And so I've had it play out in me personally. And the way things are right now, and it's my close distance between here and Mexico, my wife and I rarely go outside of our RV park because ICE is constantly patrolling our areas, and they can just see me like make a wrong turn or go too fast or something, pull me over, and without explanation, they can detain me and take me away. And my wife would never know to me until whenever she was finally able to find me. That's the way we're living right now in our society. It's very crucial. It's very dangerous. And so I'm very grateful that the Lord has given me this opportunity to serve the church by, administrating this office to take on very important projects. So thank you, Bishop Greer, for this time.
Well, thank you for being here, Padre Ricardo. Reverend Mark, you have any closing thoughts or comments or questions?
No, just Padre, thank you for all that you're doing, and we just have to keep the faith and live in hope.
Right. Well, Dr. Mark, feel free to come on board and join us anytime, and we certainly could enjoy your commentary and your ideas. This is very much an organic, movement. Would you say, Bishop Greer? We've been at it now for about 11 months, and I think we've made significant progress each month, and we're ready now to kick it open. And by the way, Dr. Mark, make sure you get and download the latest issue of Convergent Streams.
Always helping me push Convergent Streams. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great journal. I got mine a few days ago. Here it is, my print edition. It's a beautiful magazine, and I bought 4 of them from friends of mine to get this from Amazon. It was $9.99. So if you haven't got yours yet, I'm sure Bishop Greer will be happy to give you the link.
Absolutely. Bishop Ben, any final thoughts, comments, or questions?
No, just thank you for sharing, Father Ricardo. We appreciate you, and thank you.
Thank you.
And I will say it has been an interesting 11 months building this project. We stand on the cusp of beginning the large messaging campaign and getting the word out about it that starts August 1st. And I'm sure we'll have you back, Padre Ricardo, in the future to update us on the progress of
Love to
of this project. And we so appreciate all your hard work. Thank you for coming here tonight. Thank you, Reverend Mark and Bishop Ben, for being here as always. I so appreciate it.
Nice to meet you, Reverend Mark.
Thank you for having us.
I look forward to seeing you next Friday night at our next leadership meeting.
Está bien.
And thank you all for joining us tonight in our studio audience. And just a reminder that you can find us at podcast.myocci.social, as well as Apple Podcast and wherever you get your favorite podcasts from. Join us again next Saturday when we have an exciting topic. And we once again attempt to expand your... Keep shining bright, my friends.
Thanks for spending this time with us on Expanding Your Faith. If today's conversation encouraged you, share the episode. It helps more people find the show. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also find us online at podcasts.myocci.social and our stfrancis.org. Follow us on Facebook at Expanding Your Faith. Our producer is Bishop Ben Williams. Expanding Your Faith is an outreach ministry of St. Francis Parish and Outreach in Augusta, Georgia. Produced in cooperation with the Metropolitan Community Church of Our Redeemer in Augusta, Georgia. Until next time, keep expanding your faith.